Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm John Kennedy.
I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And today we have Jesus sending out his apostles on a mission, but before we find he has compassion on the crowds, but apparently not so much compassion on the disciples because he tells them they can't even carry sandals or a stick. So let's see what's going on here. This is Matthew chapters 9, verse 35 through chapter 10, verse 23. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's the right response.
I mean, this is like, first of all, I think it's, again, helpful to remind ourselves what the Methane Community is going through, because I think Matthew and Mark both have this kind of a story where Jesus sends out his missionary, disciples, and in Mark, they're sent in pairs, and in here, they're just listed in pairs, and so it sort of implies that there was a similar story going around by Matthew's time. But the intensity in Matthew is so much greater than it is in Mark. And I think it speaks to the decades that, the intervening decades between when Mark was written and Matthew's written, because in Mark, there's not a lot of hints of, violent pushback or anything like that. But in Matthew, it's all about that. And I think in Matthew's community, there's so much evidence that this community's already been cast out of the synagogues. There's already division from early church, which were Jews, having followed Jesus. And so every time in here when Jesus talks about synagogues, it's either their synagogues or the synagogues of the hypocrites, and so of course they're all Jewish people in this gospel, but I don't know, it's just, you can palpably feel the pain and sort of what they're up against in Matthew's community. So that strikes me the most from the 10,000 feet.
Indeed. Yeah.
Before we get into the words of the text.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because this is super layered, and it's layered in with the Methane community. I also think it has to do with, Jesus on the ground in his time too. And so often when I read this versus some of the other 99 podcasts we have done, how much of this is about the disciples, the apostles, the church.
Right.
And just as, John, you said the other day, Evelyn Underhill's the interesting thing about religion is God. I happen to think that the interesting thing about Christianity is Jesus. No offense to the disciples and the apostles. I find Jesus the most interesting and compelling. And so when I hit this, the first thing I land is right there in the first verse there, 9:35, where we get that kind of hinge verse where we've had the first discourse, the Sermon on the Mount, and then we've had the 10 miracles, the 9/10 miracles, and then we get this summary that Jesus is moving about, and that's what's going on. Jesus' ministry is moving, right? A man on the move, and he teaches, and he proclaims, and he cures. Those are the three things that he does. We get, and so then we launch into the next thing here, and then it says that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them. And that is, to my mind, one of the most interesting lines in the whole thing, because what is Jesus? What was Jesus like? And what was Jesus' inner life like? And we had that a few weeks ago with Jesus's high priestly prayer. And now in the way biblical compassion. What is biblical compassion? And as you guys know, the Greek word for that is the same as like intestines and gut.
Right. Yes.
And so Jesus feels in his gut, in his intestines, it makes him almost nauseous, his compassion for these people. And so that is actually the springboard for the whole mission is Jesus's compassion.
I love that.
And so it comes out of Jesus's inner life, and what does he see? He says they're harassed and helpless, sheep without a shepherd, and that's what he sees. He sees like, oh man, this is bad, and it almost like he says, oh man, this is super bad, and I can't do this all by myself. I got to get these guys to kick into gear.
Yeah.
His compassion has to actualize.
Yeah, which is sort of provocative. This idea that Jesus needs or at least wants help, even while he's still around. I mean, it's one thing to have the Great Commission, which we had a couple weeks ago, post-resurrection Jesus, he's about to peace out to the heavenly realm. Of course, at that point, the apostles are needed. But Jesus is still very much around, and he's still saying, hey, help me with this.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
I'm sending you out.
Yeah. And he's also telling them to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers. Right. And it's kind of a funny thing we gloss over.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other translation for that, is pray, where we got ask the Lord of the harvest.
Yes,
I think the older translation used to say pray the Lord of the harvest.
Right.
And outside of the Lord's Prayer, I don't think Jesus anywhere else in the Synoptic Gospels anyway tells his disciples what to pray for. He tells them to pray persistently and so on, and to pray in faith, but doesn't really specify the content outside of the Lord's Prayer. But here he says, pray that the Lord will send laborers into the harvest.
Yeah, somewhere I like this. Oh, this is like Jesus' prayer for 20 on Jeopardy here. I mean, in Gethsemane, does he say to them, pray that you might not be led into
Oh, okay.
temptation,
So
or something
maybe
like that.
I'm wrong about
No,
this.
but I like where you're going with this, where
Yeah.
he's very, very particular.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the crazy thing is they're the answer to the prayers.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Watch what you pray for.
Yeah.
This
Right.
is the ultimate watch what you pray for.
Indeed, it really is. And at first it sounds kind of awesome, oh, we get to cure and cast out demons just like our
Gets off to a good
rabbi.
Raise
start.
the dead.
Right. I mean, okay, so we can't wear shoes for some reason, but whatever, still sounds pretty good. And yeah, if people don't like us, we get to shake off the dust of our shoes, which is obviously the original,
Yeah, it's the original.
dusting off the haters.
Right.
Yeah.
But then it takes a turn to this scarier discourse about coming persecution. But maybe let's not move too quickly into that. I mean, there's so much in this gospel. Maybe.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this is the mission to the people of Israel,
Right.
and
Yes.
not to the Gentiles. I mean, I
Right.
think that's one of the things we
Yeah.
probably ought to spend
is
a few
definitely worth
moments on
tackling.
here.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it hints at what Paul was talking about to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And at the end of Matthew,
Right.
of course,
Right.
in chapter 28, he says, go to all the Gentiles. So at this point, as you were saying, Peter, it's still staying in Jesus's earthly ministry here that he's sent to his own people. He's sent to the Israelites and later commissions them all to go to the whole world. But
Yeah.
the early church just isn't quite ready for the worldwide mission.
Right.
They have a lot of tumult, I think, still among their own people.
100%. And one of the things that I learned in seminary, which I had no idea about, was that Judaism, as we know Judaism, was really being created at the same time that Christianity was being created in the post-temple era, the after 70 AD era. I want to read you something that I read in a commentary when I was preparing for our discourse here, our conversation. I just want to say that I'm not an expert on anything, and I'm really not an expert on what I'm about to read to you, but I found it so provocative and so thought-provoking that I realized I really didn't know what I was talking about. This comes from Daniel Harrington, who's the editor of the Sacred Pagina commentary series, which is an excellent series. And he writes that the Methane Community, which perceived itself as having a special role within Israel to show other Jews that theirs was the authentic way of Judaism after AD 70. The aim of the Jewish mission was not to convert Jews to Christianity as from one religion to another. Rather, it was to suggest that after AD 70, Christian Judaism was the best way to carry out the Jewish tradition.
Interesting.
Yeah, that left me in the super but I wanted to lay it out there to maybe bring some depth to those of you who are listening to our pod might do some more exploration here, which is to say, as you're pointing out, the complications of the Methane community. This is an intra-Jewish conversation greatly.
So.
Yeah.
And we're picking this up much later as people who are not Jewish.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense to me. I mean, when you think about how they had to flee Jerusalem and gather in these other places and organize and figure out how to cohere and maintain their identity as Jewish people, and they all had different ideas. And, if it's true what some scholars say, that in the destruction of the temple, it was completely leveled and their high priests were murdered along with their families, and, very few high leaders got out, they would organize around other, teachers and, I don't know, scribes and stuff. And I think each sect had to figure out what was the way forward. And these people who'd experienced Jesus as alive and been transformed by that encounter and walked the earth with him, I mean, obviously they had this whole new lens with which to view their own tradition. And for some who didn't experience that, I mean, why would they jump on board so quickly? I don't know. I think it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be all this conflict, and that the fledgling early church, it just, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've never read that. Yeah. And that's a really interesting thing to say.
That is, yeah. I mean, of course it is natural if you're a group of Jews who have come to have faith in Jesus as the Messiah, that you would, this isn't like optional. This is like, all my people need to get on board with this, not out of like, in its best form anyway, not out of a desire just to make them like me, but as a desire to bring them into the reality of what God has done. But of course, that brought about conflict. And I was doing a little bit of reading about the Christian community in Antioch, where Matthew was likely composed, and that elsewhere in the New Testament, in Acts and in Paul's letters, we see Antioch as the site, one of the sites of dispute, not only as to whether Jesus is the Messiah, but what the practice of Jews who believe, or those who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, should be with regards to circumcision, with regards to dietary laws. So there was conflict not only among Jews who believed in Jesus and Jews who didn't, but a conflict, intra-conflict among those Jews who believed in Jesus, because they were divided about, keeping Torah and stuff like that. So you can imagine that created all the more resentment and hostility on the part of Jews who did not believe in Jesus, because there'd be absolutely no basis for considering the steps that Christians ultimately took away from observance of certain Torah matters. It seems like we are getting very fierce opposition reflected not only in Jesus' time, and maybe not even so much in Jesus' time as much as in the time that this was composed. I mean, we get a real mixing of time periods, right? Because Jesus is talking about, at first, a mission going on during his ministry, not to the Gentiles, and then it kind of jumps, seeming to borrow material from Mark's gospel, which is clearly talking about an eschatological event later. It's just dropped in the middle of things here, and the fact that there's a mixing of time periods is evident not only from a comparison with Mark, but because even though Jesus had just said, don't go to the Gentiles, in verse 18, he says, you will be dragged before the Gentiles. So there's a mixing of time periods going on here. But opposition was the norm for early Christians, which is easy for us sitting in New Canaan, Connecticut, and elsewhere in the Western world to forget. But not everywhere in the world, because Christians still face tremendous opposition, not at all unlike what we find here. And it's, I think, so important to remember that.
I was just reading about the Archbishop of Canterbury speaking about the African Archbishop's refusal to have him be to gather around his see of his seat. And in his prayer, he was praying for, at the end of this statement that came out of Canterbury, for all of those Christians who received, whose lives were threatened by following Jesus. And so, yes, still very much this gospel would mean a lot more to a lot of people than it might mean to us. We can walk out of this church and go to the grocery store. No one's going to kill us because we got a collar on. I think that one of the things that's also noticeable here for me is, back to Jesus being the interesting thing here, is that when they get these instructions on being sent out, that they're not taught to teach, they're to proclaim and they're to cure. And one of the things, Elizabeth, you had spoken about in some previous podcasts was about Jesus teaching. I mean, I'm 99 podcasts into listening to you talk about, we need to pay attention to what Jesus is teaching, right? And here they don't get the gift, the charism of teaching until Jesus is done. That comes in what you were talking about, Matthew 28, when he says, go and teach, obey that all of which I have taught you. But here, it's like they don't, they're still in school. They're not quite ready to be teachers when he sends them out. Proclaim and cure, but not to teach.
I mean, he breaks it down for them, what it means to proclaim the kingdom of heaven has come near, heal, cure, act. And so he doesn't separate between the healing and the proclaiming. But back to the question about who Jesus is in this early church emerging, I think, imagine like Jewish people are expecting Messiah to set things right and bring justice to the earth and, restore the kingdom of Israel. And it would be a lot to expect them to recognize Jesus as this Messiah.
Sure.
So, I mean, he was ahead of his time then. He's ahead of his time now. He's so radical. Nobody wants to actually do what he does, and I think that it's important to remember that they argued over practices and form and how to gather and who was in charge and all that. But at the heart of it all was Jesus is or isn't the Messiah that they're all waiting for.
Yeah.
And if he is, oh wow, we have a lot of rethinking to do of what these prophets were talking about and what our work is on this earth and all that stuff. And he comes for the whole world, but he comes to like heal divisions. And we do nothing but divide ourselves,
Well, he even says in here that this is going to be divisive, right?
Yeah.
The family stuff is divisive.
Totally.
They're going to bring you before leaders of synagogues and governments. And I think that Jesus appears. I mean, one of the things we get here. This is reason this text is so interesting for those who study this time period in early Christianity and what's happening with the church and what's happening with the synagogues at this period, is that there is a marketplace of ideas, right? And there is a marketplace, and Jesus is one of the guys in the marketplace, and in the Methane community, the resurrected Jesus is one of the guys in the marketplace, and that's what's coming out. And so we get these instructions here about how to do it. And the Didache, which we were talking about last week, I believe, I did a little bit of reading, and it turns out the Didache was created at the same time as Matthew's Gospel. And it's a handbook for Christian living, and it has elaborate instructions on how to go out or how to receive these traveling apostles and prophets. And I had read, but forgotten that I had read, and relearned again what I think is about the funniest line about hospitality, which is this prophet or apostle can stay with you one day, maybe two, but if he stays 3 days, he's a false prophet. That's right up there with Jesus' line from last week when he says, "Go away."
It belongs on a cocktail napkin or something.
So all this stuff has its life in more than one time period. Jesus' time period, Matthew's time period,
Indeed.
Didache. Currently, there's these guys wandering around. You got to figure out what to do with them.
Yeah.
It's like, a house guest is like a fish. It rots in 3 days or something.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Funny.
I
think the first century hospitality rules are lost on us in this gospel. Because what could be less enticing than, to take a job where you're not allowed to take any money, no extra clothes, nothing to wear on your feet. Plus you would, I don't know, in today's world, you would look like you're not very successful. And I don't think it's a great selling point, but here it's a whole other thing at work.
I think this is the exact opposite of televangelism, to make a little shout out to televangelism. This is to say, do not send money because I'm praying for you. Do not, all that raising money on TV schemes that started somewhere in the 80s when I wasn't watching that kind of TV. All that stuff rose up. I missed most of it, but when I look back on it now, this is the exact opposite of television.
Yeah,
absolutely.
100%.
Talk about how to detect a false prophet, not just in evangelicalism or Christianity, but in any movement. If it's ever supposed to be a spiritual teaching or sort of a word from God or the divine in any way, but you got to pay for it. Red flag, major red flag.
But the interesting thing, just to balance that, amen. Yeah. But in another place, Jesus says a laborer deserves his wages. So it's there is this like, okay, I realize,
which is in itself in tension with Paul's teaching, which is like, I make my own tents. I pay my own way.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be an encumbrance to anybody. The gospel is not going to be, an imposition on anybody. And Jesus has got a slightly different.
That's funny. Paul, holier than thou. Yeah.
Well, Mark and Matthew have two different philosophies going too, because Mark requires them to take sandals and a staff.
Right.
And
That's a good
don't
call.
take any
Mark goes
sandals.
easier
That's a good call. That's a very good call.
Right.
Yeah.
Sandals in a stick or no sandals in a stick. It's hard to.
But if someone knocks on your door and they're dirty and they have no shoes and they're hungry, they might tell you some good news, but they look very needy. And I don't know. There's a whole
that's really interesting.
There are many ways to read what's going on here. But
well, and also, we don't need to beat the pulp out of this, but I can't help but to put on these glasses for a little while and think of St. Francis of Assisi, who wanted to imitate all this, and the Franciscan brothers and sisters. Actually, the Franciscan sisters are convented, cloistered. But anyway, what Francis took from all this, but also that we get in here, we get all kinds of layering in of the Hebrew story, right? Where we get the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, which roots this in the Hebrew story. It also gives it eschatological consequences here. The day of judgment,
right?
And you're in the midst of wolves, and what does it mean to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves? Which is a fantastic line, by the way. Yeah. Just a fantastic line. What is Jesus getting at here? And then he says, "Don't worry."
Right.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
This is going to be terrible, but do not worry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So thinking about our time here, I wonder if we want to turn to the eschatological dimension, since we've already begun to open that up. I think one of the most challenging verses in all of Scripture, certainly in the Gospels, is the last verse of this passage. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. This can seem to suggest that Jesus thought the end of the world would come a lot sooner than it did, because obviously we are recording this podcast some 2,000 years after all these events. The world's still here. So, Albert Schweitzer, who was a theologian and a minister, among like many, many, many other things, organist, etc., he thought this was evidence that Jesus was deluded, like holy, but deluded, that he thought
he was wrong.
Yeah. So let's kick this around. Was Jesus wrong, or is there another way to understand what he means here?
I would put that on Matthew more than on Jesus. Matthew's writing a story for a particular community about Jesus, and I don't know that I don't think it's helpful to get lost in speculating what he meant by that. But I know that the people were in crisis and that they had a big task in front of them to establish themselves and to, carry forward what Jesus had put upon them to do. Mm-hmm. And there's urgency. To me, it speaks of the urgency that, they need to do this work. And in terms of like what it means for the Son of Man to come, I think it's read by a lot of people who believe in raptures and things like that as a threatening phrase, that hurry up because the world's going to come to an end, rather than, do the work so everyone can realize the peace and the kingdom of heaven coming, and it could happen quickly. And I think we're so prone to read this as sort of threatening, dire news, but it's actually the best news there is, and Jesus, the Son of Man, comes all the time, and we can't recognize it. But when we help people come to realize we don't have to hate one another, we don't have to worry about otherness and being threatened by different styles and points of view and all that stuff, if we do that work and we embody the love of God in our lives, God comes into that. Jesus comes into that and is embodied. And to me, that's what this has come to mean, that the kingdom of heaven has come near is the good news of Jesus. That's what he's proclaiming. That's what he's telling them to proclaim. He's not telling them turn or burn, And it's a whole different message than has been peddled by modern Christianity. Yeah. Or I should say some strains of Christianity.
Yeah, I don't know the answer at all.
But I just told you the answer.
That's fantastic.
Just kidding.
You had the answer.
Rob, I want to just, Rob's behind the camera.
Kidding.
Rob was Elizabeth right. Anyway, it's interesting. So you're putting this, the kind of Methane lens, and also the lens of it's all happening all the time, which is a way to think about this. And I think the Son of Man stuff isn't that Daniel 7, where you get this Son of Man, and how does Jesus think about what it means to be Son of Man? And I know some have interpreted the Son of Man it came at the crucifixion,
Right.
And resurrection and ascension. That's what this means. And the truth is, I actually don't know what it means exactly, but I'm not anxious about that, and I'm not anxious whether or not Jesus is perfect in everything that we get in the red letter version of our Bibles. I don't need Jesus to be perfect on all of these things, because I think there are things that are our scriptures. There are mysteries in our scriptures, and there are the hard words, and there are many passages that are difficult for us. And there's those two book series written by, I think, a biblical theologian in Scotland called The Hard Sayings of Jesus, and where he takes on these hard sayings. But I don't actually know. Yeah. I don't actually know. I mean, I'm open to even what Elizabeth has to say.
I don't know either.
Well,
it's just,
I mean, I don't think any of us know. Just like we're considering, maybe Jesus didn't know. But some support for a Matthean view that the coming of the Son of Man was fulfilled in the crucifixion and the resurrection just comes later in that gospel. I mean, in Matthew 26, we have Jesus on trial, and he says, "From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." From now on, which suggests,
interesting.
What's
you're going right to the verse there. Yeah.
And then the next chapter, when Jesus dies, we get, apocalyptic resonances and happenings. We get the temple curtain torn down the middle. We get the graves opened, or the tombs opened, and dead people walking around. And Matthew claims seen by many.
Right.
Though nobody else in the Bible mentions it. But suggesting that something had happened here. And of course, it's also a possible meaning that the coming of the Son of Man, a judgment, occurred with the destruction of the temple, because Jesus is sending his apostles out among the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to gather them all in faith in Jesus and finding life in his name, although obviously that's borrowing from John. But and there are words of judgment against those who do not receive the message. And part of what Jesus is telling his fellow Jews and Israelites to do is turn from violence. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, etc. Put down your swords. And of course, the destruction of the temple happened in large part because certain of Jesus's people would not put down their swords. And so a judgment did come upon them in a very real way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of possibility here with, all these apocalyptic images that are first century and into the first millennia and now. But we're used to imagining the end of the world or the kingdom of God coming as all of us rising up and going out there somewhere else, going to heaven. And we rarely stop and take Jesus at his word that the kingdom of heaven has broken in here into our world, into this earth, and that's the good news. I mean, it's plain on the page in every gospel. Definitely. And we're so determined to escape this planet and put an end to it all. And it's really, I think, such a disservice to the richness of Jesus' teaching. Yeah. And even the whole Jewish tradition is to bring justice to the earth and heal the world,
Amen.
Just to say also, I know we have to wrap it up here, but just the book of Revelation does end with heaven coming to earth, not earth going to heaven.
Right.
I mean, that's what the book of Revelation does.
It
goes this way.
Yeah.
It goes this way.
But anyway. Absolutely. I mean, Jesus is telling them to go proclaim the good news. And the good news can't be that Jesus died for your sins so you can go to heaven when you die, because that hasn't happened yet. No, the good news is that the kingdom of heaven is here. So we hope that you experience the kingdom of heaven in your midst and experience good news in your life today, and hopefully because of and not just in spite of this podcast. So we'll see you next week. Peace be with you.